Hey everyone, and welcome to another one of these weekly art videos. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing 5 of the top 10 mistakes that I constantly see beginners struggling with when they're getting started on their journeys with watercolor, and that honestly I struggled with myself when I was first getting started with this medium. I wanted to break up these 10 common mistakes into 2 separate videos so that I could really delve deeper into each mistake, explain why this is a mistake, how to do things better, and also provide exercises that will help you improve your skills and move forward faster. I really think that knowing the why behind things is going to help you improve faster, so I did want to make these nice and thorough. So do make sure to stay tuned for the second video, which will be shared next week, where I'll be including mistakes 6 through 10. Now, one quick disclaimer before jumping in, I am not here to tell you how to paint. I'm not here to tell you how to create art. I'm not here to tell you that you're doing things wrong. I'm a big believer in that there is no specific way or no right way to create art, no specific one way to use any drawing or painting medium. You can do whatever you wish. If you're doing any of the 10 things that I'm going to be sharing in these videos and you're liking the results, by all means continue doing it. The list of 10 things that I'll be including in these videos are just things that I have seen have greatly helped my own students throughout the years. They are all things that I have discovered myself lead to better results, at least for myself when painting with this medium, or that I have learned from other watercolor artists that I greatly admire. So with all this said, let's go ahead and jump in. I have not arranged these in any level of importance or anything like that. I would say all of these are equally essential to understand. Mistake number 1 that I see beginners doing is using the wrong paper. In this first part of this video, you're going to see me explore painting on 4 different types of paper. First, I'm going to be creating some brush strokes and painting some shapes or some washes on regular printing paper. Then I'm going to do the same on bristle paper intended for drawing, then on cheaper watercolor paper, and then on better quality watercolor paper. I made sure to write down what type of paper I am painting on as well as its thickness or weight right there on the top left for you so that you can see what I am painting on as I am going about this exploration. I'll talk more about my observations that I was making as I was painting and the observations I made after everything had dried on each of these papers in just a bit. But first, I just want to talk about something that's very important for me. I know that quality watercolor paper can be quite expensive, and to be honest with you, the first couple of years of my journey with watercolor, I was focusing on getting to know the medium. I was focusing on staying consistent with my practice, and that's what most mattered to me in the beginning. Having the highest quality supplies on hand and things like that, it just wasn't on top of my priority list. I was focusing more on exploring, experimenting, seeing if I enjoyed the medium and its main kind of characteristics so that I could decide if it would be a long-term thing that would be actually worth investing in. And I also know that just because you have the highest quality supplies, it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be creating the highest quality art. Just like having Michael Jordan sneakers is not going to make you the best basketball player, having the highest quality art supplies is not going to make you the best artist. I've always admired artists who are able to do great work with the supplies that they have available, with limited supplies or even cheap supplies. And I just don't think that pushing beginners into buying the highest quality everything is the best idea or necessarily the best for everyone. I think it ostracizes people and it keeps a lot of beginners from not fully wanting to jump into their art practice, and I think that's very unfortunate. Can you do that if you have the budget to, if you can afford the highest quality everything? Sure, you can absolutely do it, and maybe it will get you farther ahead faster in terms of building up your skills. But is it necessary? I don't think so. I would much rather you buy supplies that you're not going to be feeling bad about using or quote unquote wasting, and building up that consistency in your art practice. And also, of course, focusing on covering the fundamentals in the beginning, because if you skip over them, I assure you that later on in your journey, you're going to be hitting walls. What do I mean with the fundamentals? I mean elements and principles of art, composition, form and perspective, light behavior and value, color theory, all of that good stuff that is going to help you. Doesn't matter what kind of artwork it is that you want to be creating in the future. And by the way, a lot of that knowledge on the fundamentals is developed via drawing, not painting. So in the beginning, yes, I was using watercolor paper that was intended for water-soluble mediums, but it was student-grade paper. It was not 100% cotton. It was not the highest quality. I was also using student-grade paint, especially the Winsor Newton Cotman line little sets and just cheap synthetic brushes. And I still use pretty inexpensive brushes to the day. Nowadays, though, if there is anything that I would invest in more, it's actually the paper. You can create awesome artwork on great quality paper and using student grade paint and student grade brushes. After painting with this medium for many years now and having developed my skills to a higher level, I can now confidently say that if I were to invest in any of these main three supplies, it would first be in the paper, then I would invest in the paint, and then I would invest in the brushes. If there was a level of importance or an order of importance, that's what I would go with. And of course, different artists are going to have different preferences in terms of both the priorities in which they buy their art supplies, but also the type of paper in and of itself. Different artists are going to choose different types of watercolor paper depending on the specific techniques that they like using that help them arrive at the results that they personally like. I'm going to make sure to leave a link to a video where I talk all about the different types of watercolor paper that you can find out there in art supply stores down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. All right, so I just finished up my exploration here on this regular printing paper. This is just a sheet of paper that I took from my printer. This paper is very, very thin, and you can see how it very easily warps and buckles. You can see this especially in the larger shapes and washes that I painted. If I had continued painting over those sections while they were wet or had simply not been as gentle when I was doing those strokes, I would have started very easily making holes in that paper, which would have been very, very frustrating. And not only is this paper very fragile, and how it warps and buckles along the way creates puddles, which leads to undesired textures and effects and splotchiness and unevenness in my washes, but I'm also virtually unable to create those beautiful organic wet on wet effects that watercolor allows when you paint on watercolor paper. Even cheaper watercolor paper. I'm getting nowhere near the effects that I want. I'm getting splotchiness, I'm getting backruns, I'm getting cauliflower effects. I'm not getting soft transitions and gradients. And not only this, but the color is just not as vibrant. I'm going to allow this to dry, and later on we're going to be comparing all of these papers all together once all of them are completely dry. Moving on to bristle paper or bristle board. This is paper that I bought for drawing purposes. It is super smooth and it is definitely a lot thicker than my regular printing paper that I was painting on previously. Bristle board paper is usually available in two main types, which are vellum surface and smooth surface. And just so you're aware, I am using bristle paper that has a vellum finish to it. Both are super smooth, and I would compare them more to hot press watercolor paper, which is the smoothest, less textured watercolor paper out there. And this is 100 pounds or 270 GSM in thickness or in weight. So it is a lot thicker than the previous one, which leads to less buckling and warping. So if you were to use thinner bristle paper, then that might be an issue and might be more frustrating. But even though this is thicker paper and I'm not really getting any buckling or warping because of this, what I'm noticing is that my paint and my water are not getting absorbed into that paper as they would if I were using watercolor paper. My paint and my water are sitting on that surface, pulling in certain areas and not getting very quickly absorbed into the paper as they would when I am painting on watercolor paper. And this leads to splotchiness and undesired textures that I maybe don't want. I am now getting started with my larger shapes and washes, and I'm going to be attempting to do some wet on wet by dropping in some paint on a layer of paint that is still wet and seeing how those effects happen on this paper. The effects that I'm getting are not bad at all. I am going to be doing a second wash where I spend a little bit longer on that initial layer so that it can stay wetter for longer before I drop in the second color. And I do get that second color to expand out more like it would with watercolor paper, as opposed to that first wash experiment that I did where I first placed that magenta-y pink color and then I dropped in the blue on top. That blue didn't expand out very much at all. And it was because I didn't spend as long painting in that pink color first. And I didn't make sure to use enough water there. So even though I did get an interesting effect, the edges are still quite defined and clean, and that paint didn't expand out very much at all. Whereas with the second wash, where I first placed the blue and then the green, I did get more of that soft transition that I was looking for. I can see it working very well for gouache and maybe certain types of watercolor styles where you're maybe using a smaller amount of water, or techniques that require not too much water, or maybe you're not going for those more wet on wet organic gradient style effects. For me, I don't think it's optimal at all. I think this paper is better suited for drawing, maybe gouache and other painting mediums. But with my specific techniques and the styles that I like arriving at, I wouldn't say it's the best. I would definitely go with at least some type of watercolor paper. It's comparable to mixed media paper that I've worked on in the past. Usually, I'm not very pleased with the results of watercolor on mixed media sketchbooks or paper. I got a lot of very noticeable textures and unevenness due to pulling. And I also noticed that the color is not as vibrant unless I go in and create multiple layers. All right, moving on to the third type of paper that I'm going to be experimenting with on screen today, and this is the cheaper watercolor paper. This is not 100% cotton, and it is 90 pounds or 190 GSM in thickness or in weight. And this is actually a piece of this larger sheet that I got in my local art supply store. I just cut off a part of it, and I noticed a couple of things right away. Number one, I am getting a lot of buckling and warping, even with these thin brush strokes that I'm creating. And number two, there is definitely something wrong with the sizing of this paper. If you don't know what sizing is a substance that is added to watercolor paper in order to alter its level of absorbency. When you're working on good watercolor paper, you can place that paint on the paper and you still have some time to move the pigment around, to do lifting, to do wet on wet effects, etc. So in other words, it helps the paint perform as it should. It also helps protect the paper from wear and abrasion. It makes it stronger. And sizing can be added into the paper as it's being manufactured, and it can also be added afterward on its surface. So what I am noticing here is that the paint is very quickly sinking into the paper. I'm not really able to play around with it very much at all. It's sitting on the paper in a weird way, not really creating those beautiful diffused out watercolor effects. For example, here where I'm dropping in more paint on that first layer that should still be wet, none of these wet on wet effects are happening. You can also see these little white specks or dots throughout my color that I am placing, and unevenness present throughout that color that I am laying down. Unfortunately, it is quite common for the sizing of watercolor paper to get damaged. For example, when you're buying watercolor paper pads or large rolls of large sheets, the way that I did for this one, the paper can get damaged wherever it is being stored in those art supply stores. If there is too much humidity or the paper is simply old, the sizing can start deteriorating. And sometimes it's just sections of that sheet, and other times it can be the entire sheet. In this bottom last wash that I'm creating, I do get better effects when I drop in that second color. It makes me think that the sizing in this bottom portion of the paper is maybe not as damaged as the upper sections. But overall, I would say I am not pleased with the splotchiness, with the sunken in color that lacks vibrancy, and also the large amount of buckling and warping. If I try to paint an actual full painting on this paper, it would be super, super frustrating and the results would not be good. All right, and finally, let's move on to painting on actual 100% cotton watercolor paper. It's 140 pounds or 300 GSM in heaviness or thickness, which is my favorite weight or thickness to work on. And this is cold press paper from Strathmore. Usually cold press paper has some amount of texture to it, but this cold press paper from Strathmore, which is from their Ready Cut series, is pretty smooth. It's more similar to hot press watercolor paper that I've worked on in the past. But whatever the case may be, it's good quality paper and it is 100% cotton. I'm going to use the exact same colors that I've been using for all of these explorations, and my consistencies of my color mixers on my palette are also relatively the same, meaning I have kind of similar paint to water ratios to what I've been using with the past papers. Some of these larger shapes, larger washes that I'm painting, I am simply going in with just one layer of paint, painting those strokes relatively quickly and allowing them to dry. And other times I'm running my paintbrush bristles over that same first layer several times to keep it wetter for longer. And then I'm dropping in a second color to see what effects come out. Here are my final results, still wet on this 100% cotton watercolor paper. I definitely noticed a lot less buckling than with the first watercolor paper that I was experimenting on, and I was much more easily able to create these diffused out, soft, wet on wet transitions and effects. All right, so all of my explorations have completely dried, and now we can see the final results here. So this is my regular printing paper. You can see how dull the color looks, how I have lots of splotchiness, and also I'm going to turn this paper around so that you can see how much the buckling and the warping is affecting the evenness of the paper. Here is the bristle board, and you can also see plenty of texture in my explorations here. Even the blue with the green wash that looked good before, now I can see tons of cauliflower effects and like backgrounds and texture that I didn't see before when things were wet. When I turn it around, it does look quite smooth, and this makes sense because this paper is a good weight and that paint wasn't able to completely soak through to the other side. Now let's look at the cheaper watercolor paper explorations. You can see how the color appears quite dull, quite light, and I didn't get as much texture and splotchiness as I did with my other papers, but I wasn't able to get those organic wet on wet watercolor effects that I can create so easily with watercolor paper. And also because the paper is quite thin, I still have buckling and warping, and you can see how the paint kind of soaked through all the way to the other side, and you can see those dots and that unevenness that happened due to the sizing of this paper being damaged. And finally, moving on to the actual 100% cotton, 140 pounds watercolor paper. And here you can see that the color appears much more vibrant. I was able to more easily get those soft, diffused out gradients and effects. I do have some amount of unevenness present in the brush strokes at the top, and this could be due to the fact that this paper is quite smooth, so it doesn't absorb the paint as quickly, which can certainly lead to some amount of pulling and unevenness. Usually, the more textured watercolor paper is, the more quickly it's going to absorb that paint. Overall, the color is much more vibrant. The washes look a lot better than the washes on my other papers. None of my paint soaked through to the other side, and there is no buckling and warping after this has dried. Here are my explorations on all 4 papers side by side so that you can compare them now that they are all completely dry. Let's move on to common beginner mistake number 2. And this is not considering paintbrush type and size before jumping into the next part of your painting process. And this is a wonderful exercise right here that I'm going to be working on, which I would recommend doing if you're just getting started with watercolor. It's super helpful. Not only will it help you continue developing your water control, but you can also practice switching between different paintbrush types and sizes as you're moving along, filling in these shapes, which is something that you're going to have to do when you're moving along in any painting process. I just drew many different shapes for myself, some of them organic, some of them geometric, in this little watercolor sketchbook that I have, and I'm just starting to fill these shapes in with different brushes. Some of these I'm going to actually be using the brush that I would think is appropriate for that size of shape and its complexity, and other shapes I'm going to be filling in with the wrong brush. I must say that I only work with rounds and flats. I don't concern myself with getting fan brushes or rigger brushes or angled brushes or filberts or anything like that. I stick to what's most practical and versatile, which are rounds and flats. I do enjoy using filberts when I am painting with acrylics and oils, but when it comes to watercolor painting, I just use these 2 kinds of brushes. I do have a larger mop brush that I sometimes bring in for larger washes and backgrounds and things like that, but mop brushes are essentially large round brushes. But anyway, when we're working with this medium, it is essential to make sure that you're using the right brush. I see lots of beginners using brushes that are way too small to paint in medium to larger sized shapes, and that is only going to hinder you and make the process way more frustrating than it needs to be. When you're working with watercolor, you want to be able to load up your paintbrush bristles and work as swiftly and quickly as possible, especially in the beginning stages of the painting process, where usually we are working on those general large shapes and areas. The more times you have to go back in and move that paint around that you've placed on paper, or the more times that you have to reload your paintbrush and come back in and reload your paintbrush and come back in, the more chances there are that you'll create back runs, or that previous shape that you painted in will start drying on you before you get a chance to go back in and continue where you left off, so that you're not left with a sharp defined edge. You're just a lot more likely to be left accidentally with more texture that you weren't really intending to create. I know that as beginners, we may feel safer or more in control by using smaller brushes, and a lot of us also feel that need in the beginning to keep perfecting, to keep moving things around. But this is something that I have found in my own journey. The more I practice using the right brush, going in confidently with a good amount of paint and water, and allowing that paint to do its own thing as much as possible, the better the outcome is going to be, the fresher the look, and also the less of a chance there's going to be that you're going to arrive at overworked, flat results. It's okay to go in and maybe get rid of some textures that you don't like while that paint is still wet. or going in and softening edges, or doing intentional lifting, or going in and dropping in more color while that paint is still wet and workable. But nowadays, I try my best to keep these things to a minimum. I do them intentionally and gently, and as soon as I see that that paint is starting to dry, I don't touch it. I don't do anything at all, because that is only going to lead to splotchiness and, again, undesired textures. And this is why it's so important to pick the right brush. If you're going to be painting larger areas or even medium-sized shapes, make sure that you're choosing a medium to larger brush that is going to allow you to load up your paintbrush bristles well, and with one same paint load, so to speak, be able to cover a large area swiftly and quickly without having to reload over and over and over again. Obviously, the smaller the brush, the less amount of paint and water it's going to be able to hold in its bristles, and the more you're going to find the need to reload over and over and over again in order to fill in that medium-sized shape or large area. Every single time you have to stop and you have to reload and stop and reload, that previous shape and edge that you just painted in is going to start drying on you, especially if you're painting on dry paper. When that paper is super thirsty, things start absorbing and drying immediately. So you're just making the painting process way harder for yourself, because you're going to arrive at those sharp defined edges because your paint is going to start drying on you, and you're not going to be left with an even, smooth wash of color. You're going to have a lot of texture throughout that wash. So most of the time, I see beginners struggle with this in terms of using smaller brushes for larger areas where they should be using larger brushes and going in with more color and more water. But I've also seen it happen where beginners use a brush that is way too large for a small shape or a small area. Before going in and attempting to paint in details, consider changing to a smaller brush. When we're painting in small shapes, we need to make sure that the paintbrush is appropriate, because it is difficult as is to stay on top of water control when we're painting in small shapes. So for this kind of situation, a larger brush is not going to be helpful at all, because it's going to hold a lot more water in its bristles. So right now you're seeing me paint in this very large rectangle, and I'm using a medium-sized brush. This is a size 10 round brush, and it's definitely not optimal for this large rectangle. You can see how I have to reload my paintbrush bristles over and over and over again, and I'm having a really hard time trying to paint in this large shape quickly. And I find the need to go back in and perfect and fill in and get rid of textures, which only leads to more texture, etc. As this paint dries, you're going to be able to see that texture and the splotchiness even more. It becomes more noticeable. In just a bit, you're gonna see me paint a larger wash with a larger brush more effectively. All right, I'm gonna continue filling in these shapes with different brushes. For the first 3 shapes that I painted in, I did pick a brush that I felt would be good for that size and that level of complexity. And all of these other shapes, I am filling in with a paintbrush that is a little bit too small, a little bit too large, or simply not a paintbrush type that is optimal. For example, that red shape on the bottom left, I attempted to fill in with a flat brush, which was way too large. And for that particular shape, I don't feel that the flat brush is optimal, because it has such narrow areas and also those pointy sections. For that shape, a medium-sized round brush would be best. And there are other shapes where it would be best to have 2 paintbrushes on hand. Sometimes I have a larger brush and a medium-sized brush on hand, or a medium-sized brush and a smaller brush. It really depends on the complexity of the shape that you're painting in. Whatever the case may be, make sure that the tool that you have in your hand is appropriate for that area that you're painting or that part of the painting process that you're working on. All right, so before jumping into mistake number 3, I want to share this last exercise with you. I have two rectangles drawn that are similar in size, and I'm going to attempt to fill these in with the same color, the same consistency of color mixture that I have there on my palette, just using two very different paintbrush sizes. This first rectangle I am filling in with a very small brush. This is a size 6 round brush, and you can see the large amount of visual texture that I'm being left with because I am painting this so slowly in sections, and I'm having to constantly reload my paintbrush bristles because this paintbrush is so small for this large area. Every time that I have to reload my paintbrush, that previous shape that I painted in is already starting to dry. So you can see how I'm left with this streakiness all throughout this rectangle that I'm trying to fill in. And when I find the need to go in and fill in sections that I wasn't able to cover up, I just get left with more texture, more patchiness. And I was even left with teeny tiny sections of paper that were left unpainted because I wasn't able to go in with the appropriate amount of water and paint, which just leads to more texture when I was looking for a more even, uniform finish. So this is almost like dry brushing in certain sections. For this second rectangle on the right, I am using my larger mop brush. This is a size 6 mop brush. I made sure to load up my paintbrush bristles well before jumping in, and you can see how much I am able to cover of this rectangle with one paintbrush load. By going in confidently with a good amount of paint and water in my bristles, and with a paintbrush that is appropriate for this size, notice how quickly I was able to fill in this rectangle, and also how much more even it looks and how much less texture I have throughout. So this would be a flat wash, which is one of the 3 main washes that we should definitely practice when it comes to learning watercolor. We have the flat wash, the graded wash, and the variegated wash. I'll make sure to leave a link down below for you in the text section of this post, where I walk you through how to practice these 3 main watercolor washes. Let's move into mistake number 3 that I often see beginners making, and this is not planning and protecting highlights and light value areas. This is a big one. And this one takes a long time to get used to, especially if you started your painting journey with opaque painting mediums such as acrylics and oils. Because when painting with watercolor, it's actually kind of the inverse or the opposite to painting with opaque painting mediums like acrylics and oils. Reason being, when we're painting with watercolor, we're actually using the whiteness and the brightness of the paper to stand in place for our highlights and to help us develop light value areas. We're using the medium's translucency and transparency in combination with the paper under the paint to help us develop different values. In other words, we're not covering up the paper as we would cover up the canvas or the paper when we're painting with acrylics or oils. We're actually incorporating the paper as part of the painting. When we're painting with watercolors, we don't even need to use white paint. I don't ever use white paint at all unless I am bringing in white gouache or a white paint pen to create certain effects such as falling snow, or to add little teeny tiny highlights in animal eyes or human eyes, or maybe when I add whiskers into some animal paintings, I also bring in white gouache or a white paint pen. But generally speaking, I never use white paint because it's not necessary. And it kind of irks me that so many watercolor sets come with white and black, because neither of these are necessary when painting with watercolor. But I'll be talking more about why I'd rather not use ready-made black paint in the second video. So I'm going to be painting a couple of different spheres right now, and this is an excellent exercise as well when you're trying to get better at not only planning and protecting your highlight areas, but just developing a higher level of realism using watercolor, a sense of depth, a sense of light and shadow, a sense of 3D form. And I have an entire video tutorial in which I take you step by step through how I paint spheres using different shading techniques with watercolor. I'll make sure to link to that down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. But right now I want to demo for you just how I plan for my highlight section here, where I want to leave that paper shining through completely unpainted. So what I did with my pencil first before getting started with the painting process was I made sure to choose a light source location, if you will. So the light source in this case is hitting both of these spheres from somewhere in the top right. And so you can see that highlight shape that I created in the top right section inside of the circle. And then you can see the cast shadow shape that I created beneath the circle on the left opposite to the light source. After sketching in, mapping in that highlight shape, I started working from lights towards darks. And I'm starting to give this sphere structure, thinking of the values present throughout this sphere, the light areas, the mid-tone areas, the darkest dark areas. My highlight is just my pure white paper shining through. My light blue value areas is just plain phthalo blue with lots of water added in to get it nice and light and translucent. For my darker mid-tone areas, I am using my phthalo blue in a more saturated, less watered down state. And then my darkest value areas are actually phthalo blue plus neutral tint mixed in. In just a bit, when everything is a little bit more dry, I'm going to go in and soften the edges of that highlight shape with a clean and slightly damp brush. Right now I'm painting in the cast shadow shape, also making sure to develop different values even in the cast shadow because this is going to help it look more realistic. But just like what I did in the sphere, I am getting started with a lighter version of my plain phthalo blue, very watered down, and then I'm going to make my way incrementally towards developing those darker blue values. First, I use a phthalo blue with a lot of water in it. Then I use a phthalo blue in a less watered down state. And then finally, I add in the neutral tint into the phthalo blue to get it darker. And I add in this darker blue into the occlusion shadow sections nearest the sphere. But I talk way more about these different light areas and shadow areas in that sphere painting tutorial that I am linking to down below. This is me going in with a clean and slightly damp brush, softening the edges of that highlight shape. And you're going to notice that I go in to do some blotting with my absorbent towel. Once I'm done with this one, I'm going to be going through the exact same process and I'm going to be painting in a purple sphere. You're going to notice that I do the same thing. I'm going to make my way towards the darker colors incrementally, providing structure and a believable sense of light and shadow to this sphere. And I first made sure to plan for my highlight shape, my highlight area, where I want to have plenty of that white, bright paper shining through to help me develop the highlight and also the lighter value areas. In order to give something a believable sense of three-dimensional structure and depth, value is number one. And this simply means that we have to make sure to develop a wide range of values, light areas, mid-tone areas, and darker areas so that things don't look flat. And of course, we have to bring in, if we're not using a reference photo, we have to bring in our knowledge of light and shadow. So if light is hitting the sphere from the upper right, then where should the shadow shape be? Where should the darkest areas of the structure be? And of course, if you're painting a scene with multiple elements or a still life with multiple elements, the light and shadow situation has to be consistent throughout all of the elements involved. But we need a wide range of values throughout our different elements. We need highlight areas, we need a wide range of midtones, we need darkest areas. If we don't plan for the highlight section and we don't keep it protected throughout the painting process, we're going to limit the range of values that we're able to create. We take away the lightest value that we need, and this is going to lead to flatness in our piece. And not only this, but especially when painting with watercolor, if we don't look for ways to incorporate the whiteness of the paper as part of the piece, our paintings can certainly end up looking not only very flat, but overworked and heavy, which is usually not what we're trying to go for when we're painting with this medium. If we don't plan for highlight areas and we don't look for ways to incorporate the paper as part of the piece, then we're going to kind of remove our ability to create light paintings that seem to glow from within, which is so particular to watercolor. All right, so I'm all done with the sphere. When I finished, I removed all of that color from my paintbrush bristles. I removed the excess water by blotting my paintbrush bristles on my absorbent towel. And then I went in to do gentle scrubbing along the edges of my highlight shape to soften those edges and create a soft, gradual transition. Moving into mistake number 4, and this one is going too dark too fast. This is also something that I see beginners struggling with, and especially when you start working with acrylics and oils, this can be an issue because usually when you're working with those types of opaque painting mediums, not all the time and not every single artist does this, but it's very helpful when working with those types of mediums to work from darks towards lights. At the very end of the painting process is when you bring in your white paint and you develop those bright highlights. And when we're working with watercolor, it's the opposite. We plan and protect those highlights and we make our way towards the darker values and the more heavy, more saturated color mixtures. We start with a tea consistency and then we make our way towards the milk or butter or cream consistency incrementally, using only those types of consistencies and those darker colors where truly needed. So I am demoing this for you right here by painting a couple of different pairs. In this first pair, I am going in too dark, too fast. And you can go in too dark, too fast in a couple of different ways. The first one being you can go in with a color that is way too dark and you haven't given thought to what other color you can add into it to develop lighter values before using that color. So for example, right here you saw me go in with my green, and I didn't think of how to create a lighter green value by adding more yellow into it, perhaps, to develop lighter value areas with a lighter version of my green. I just went in straight away with my base green without giving thought to a lighter color mixture. But in another sense, I see a lot of beginners go in with color mixtures that are way too heavy, way too thick, using a milk to cream-like consistency right off the bat, when that should be something that you're working incrementally towards, and you should be starting with watery color mixtures that have a tea-like or coffee-like consistency. With this first pair, what I did was I went in with that base green, which is already quite dark and deep. This is Undersea Green from Daniel Smith. And I did keep some highlight sections protected, and I even went in to do some lifting to add more dimension into the pair, but it still looks too dark all throughout, even if I did save highlight sections. And then I added in some neutral tint to darken that green in the shadow sections. But it's still lacking dimension and glow and vibrancy. Even in the stem, I went in way too dark and saturated with my brown. I didn't give thought to how I could create at least a few different values in the stem. I took away my ability or removed my ability to develop lighter value sections in the stem. And this makes it look heavy and it makes it look flat. So now I'm going to get started with the second pair, and I'm going to show you a better way to create dimension and a sense of lightness and glow in this pair. So first, I am going in with yellow. Yellow is a great color to mix with green to create lighter green values. And I am making sure to make my way from a lighter, watered down color towards my darker green. I saved my highlight shapes. I am going in with my light yellow, making sure to run my paintbrush bristles over everything to keep things wetter for longer so that I can have nice soft effects when I drop in my next color. I am now going in with a slightly darker color, which is a mixture of my yellow with a little bit of yellow ochre. And after having dropped that in, I am finally going in with a watered down green, and I'm only using this green in mid-tone areas that I'm looking to darken, leaving the previous color, that yellow and that yellow plus yellow ochre, shining through uncovered in lighter mid-tone and lightest light areas. And I'm gonna incrementally make my way towards using my undersea green in a more saturated, thicker state. And then at the end, I'm going to be adding neutral tints and using the undersea green plus neutral tint only in darkest dark sections where I really require a darker value. So by doing this, I am not only arriving at a piece that looks way more glowy, but it also has a lot more dimension to it. It looks a lot more realistic because I am developing a wide range of both values and hues throughout the pair by giving thought to what color mixtures I would be requiring in order to do this before getting started with the painting process, making sure that I know what my base green color is going to be and what lighter color I'm going to be adding into the green for lighter green areas and what color I'm going to be adding into the green for darker green areas, but also playing with the different consistencies that I can make use of when painting with watercolor in order to develop those different value areas. Painting with watercolor is a very fluid process where we're constantly changing the ratios in our color mixers on our palette in terms of the color to color ratio if we're using more than one color in the mixer, but also the pigment to water ratio, depending on what it is that we're trying to do. Slowly but surely, incrementally, I make my way towards those darker values, those darker colors, those more heavily pigmented color mixtures, and I am giving structure to the pair. Sometimes going in to just do some lifting of excess color with a clean and slightly damp brush. What's key here is, just like what I was mentioning before, if you don't plan for the highlights, then you're gonna get rid of that possibility to create that lightest value. You're making your range of values smaller, which is gonna lead to a less realistic look. Well, same thing is happening here. If you go in way too dark too quickly, you're getting rid of your ability to develop that wide range of midtones and those lighter value sections because you're going in way too dark, way too quickly, which is only going to limit that range of values that you're able to create. Even in the stem, I am making sure to go in with my brown in a watered down state, way more watered down than what I was using with my previous pair. I'm going to allow that light brown layer to dry, and then I'll go in later on after everything has dried to darken little sections within that stem, and that's going to lead to a way more natural, realistic look than the first pair because I've developed at least somewhat of a range of values in the stem instead of going in super dark right off the bat. All right, I'm almost done with the second pair. You can see me go in and do some lifting with my clean and slightly damp brush. I'm also going to go ahead and soften the edges of my highlight shapes the same way that I did for the previous exercise. And already you can see how much more dimension and glow this second pair has over the first one. And if I wanted a higher level of realism, I could allow this to dry and then work on a second layer to develop a wider range of values, maybe darken certain areas and add more detail, whatever the case may be. Watercolor does tend to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So if we are going for higher levels of realism, it is good to work in layers. And after that first layer has dried completely, we can then go back in and darken certain sections or add more details or whatever it is that you need to do. But you can see how even with just one layer, There is way more dimension and glow in the second pair versus the first one. And finally, moving on to mistake number 5, and this one is not allowing layers to dry fully. This is also something that I see a lot of beginners struggling with, and I struggled with this so much myself to the point that I overworked and damaged my paper to death in probably the entire first year that I was painting with this medium. So if this is happening to you, please don't feel bad about it. It is so normal, especially when you started painting with mediums such as acrylics or oils, where it is not only normal but expected to go in and do tons of blending and layering. When we're working with watercolor, again, less is more, and the less moving around of pigment that you've placed on paper, the better and the fresher the results. But also, when you're gonna be working in layers, or you're intending to create wet on dry, sharp effects on soft, diffused out, wet on wet layers, things like that, it is essential to have patience and allow the previous layer to dry completely before starting to work on top of it. We have to pay attention to how wet our paper is throughout the process, and if that level of wetness or dryness is going to allow us to create the effects that we're after. And we also have to get really good at understanding when the paper is starting to dry, because as soon as it starts to dry, we should not be continuing to push forward, because that is just going to lead to overworked results and splotchiness, and maybe even to damaging your paper. I always tell my students and my community members to make sure to go in with a strategy, especially when painting with watercolor, where we can't really cover up our mistakes with another thick layer of paint or via scraping off paint off the canvas or anything like that. We are painting on paper, which is a substrate that is inherently pretty fragile, especially when it's wet, and this medium is translucent, so we're not going to be able to cover up our mistakes as we could when painting with other mediums. Every single step of the way, you have to think of what you're trying to do and make sure that the tool that you have in your hand and the technique that you're using is going to allow you to do what you want to do. When we're working with watercolor, if the paper is wet, you're gonna have soft, diffused out, blurry effects. If the paper is dry, that is gonna help you create sharp, defined details and edges to your shapes. Paint is always going to expand when the paper is wet or even partially damp. So you're gonna get soft, diffused out, blurred out edges. To different degrees, of course, because the levels of wetness can vary. So if you place paint on paper that is very, very wet, you're gonna get tons of movement. Whereas if you place it on paper that is just damp, then you're probably gonna get blurred out edges, but the paint is not going to expand as much. Whereas if you paint on paper that is dry, you're gonna get sharp, defined edges. So what are you trying to do exactly? Try to create a strategy for yourself where you think of the specific phases and techniques that you have to go through and use to create that overall end result that you're going for. In this first leaf, I am going in and just continuing to work and work and work and not allowing that paint to dry at all. And I'm trying to add in the veins of the leaf and more detail and things. I didn't really have a specific strategy, nor am I thinking of the possible consequences of my actions or trying to foresee what is going to happen or what might happen when I do certain things. I'm just continuing to add and add and add, arriving at a muddied up look that lacks dimension and any kind of intentional style or level of detail. I just continued to add and add while everything was still wet, having no patience. All those colors are merging together. I am getting rid of those lighter values, and I couldn't create those thin, tapered shapes and lines that I was trying to add in for the veins of the leaf. Whereas with the second leaf, I'm going to go in with an actual strategy, and I'm going to do it in 2 separate layers, allowing that first one to dry completely before starting to paint in the veins. So I'm getting started with the second leaf, and this is more what I would recommend doing. Making my way from light colors towards my darker colors. I got started with my yellow, making sure to go in nice and translucent and watered down. And incrementally, I am adding in darker colors on top of that layer while it was still wet in order to create soft, diffused out, wet on wet effects in this first layer. Then I can allow this layer to dry completely, and then I can go back in with a second layer where I'm going to be going in on dry paper for those sharp defined effects and edges that I want in the veins. Right here, I am finally getting started with my darker color, adding in this darker green in certain areas, keeping everything very irregular and loose. Keeping things imperfect and irregular is super important when you're painting organic objects such as leaves, trees, flowers, etc. So I don't want to create any type of organized pattern or anything like that. I'm also making sure to leave lots of sections where I have that lightest color shining through, uncovered by the darker colors. All right, so I'm all done developing different green values and hues throughout the leaf. I then allowed everything to dry completely, and it is now time to start painting in the veins, which I am painting with a size 3 round brush. So this size of brush is perfect for this detail that I'm going to be painting in. I am looking for thin lines. I'm looking for the veins of this leaf to be sharp and defined. And I also want tapered ends, especially in the small veins coming out towards the left and the right of the central vein. You can see the huge difference between this line that I am painting in and the lines that I was attempting to paint in before in the previous leaf, where I was losing control and those tapered ends were just not happening and everything was bleeding out and diffusing out too much. I'm also making sure not to go overboard with the amount of veins that I am adding in. I'm continuing to take little breaks and seeing everything as a whole so that I don't go overboard. There is no need to overly describe things when working with watercolor. I'm also liking how sections of these veins look darker and other sections look lighter, which is something that naturally happens as you continue painting with one same paint load. As your paint starts running out from your bristles, you'll notice that that color comes down lighter. And that looks more natural, in my opinion. We can use this to our advantage. Now that I've painted in those veins, I'm gonna go ahead and start darkening some sections here and there with a coffee-like consistency. I'm going to be creating abstract shadow shapes here and there to add a little bit more realism into this leaf. So I'm just darkening little sections, creating little abstract shadow shapes here and there, really trying to stay away from the outliney look, which is not going to look very realistic, and keeping everything very irregular. And after doing this, you're going to see me go in with a little bit of splattering just to add a little bit of texture into the leaf. And with that, I'm all done with these 2 leaves. You can see how different they are and how I was able to combine the wet on wet technique with the wet on dry technique, as well as layering to combine these 2 different kinds of effects that watercolor allows. The soft, blurry transitions and edges with sharper details and sharper edges. And the difference between these 2 is that for the second one, I went in with a strategy. I was thinking of the techniques that would allow me to create the effects that I was after. And of course, I was patient and allowed that first layer to dry completely before starting to add in the detail. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so,
make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much, much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love, love, love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine.
All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really, really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.